Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
And that is to receive information on Scott County Delivers topic, emergency management. And I see Chris Harder's here to kick that off. Good morning.
We have, I think, an impressive group of partners from both the county and our community, so we're excited to talk about that today. Just a couple pieces. We have spent much time over the last couple of years talking about emergency responses to the public health part of emergency management. And so it was with some strategy that we decided today not to include public health. So I just wanted to recognize those partnerships continue to exist and operate effectively. This was just an opportunity to respond and to speak to some of the work that is not specific to public health, but is more law enforcement specific. So I just wanted you to understand why public health wasn't here today. I'd like to ask the folks at the tables to hit the buttons on their microphones. People on this side of the table, if you could introduce yourselves and what department you work with. And then Scott, if you would start introductions on the panel, we'd ask you just to say who you are and who you work for, and then we'll get going. Thank you.
Barb Dahl, Health and Human Services.
Chris Loggy, Community Services.
Kate Tologic, Environmental Services.
See if we get feedback. All right, and Scott Hawes, I'm the Director of Emergency Management and 911 Communications, and I'm going to mute this.
Okay.
There you go.
Kurt Founder, Shockley, Metawakan, and Sioux Community Emergency Manager.
Haley Heidelberg, Prior Lake Savage Area Schools, Emergency Preparedness and Response Coordinator.
Joe Wida, Transportation Services.
Luke Hennon, County Sheriff.
Adam Perry, Sheriff's Office.
All right, thank you. Questions?
I can start on page 6, the first slide. So page 6 is a result of the resident survey. In their opinion, the quality of the county's disaster preparedness is increasing or improving. What is attributing to this improvement?
So that's actually a really good question. And I say that because if we move forward to some slides, we'll see a little bit of difference in how people in the county are perceiving compared to how people nationwide are perceiving readiness. So in the past, some of the things that we've done to be out and work on our outreach capabilities are we have quarterly articles in Scene that are typically published. We've been focused on the last 2 to 3 years on taking one aspect of individual preparedness and focusing on that. So for one of the articles, it was a focus on food and water supply. Another was financial planning. Another was having a disaster kit. So in that environment, we really broke down kind of this huge concept of how individuals should be ready and prepared for themselves and start to break it down into attainable, easily, small bites that people could actually take and improve upon themselves. We've also been engaged at the county fair. For example, this year we had handouts at our county fair that would help people go through a checklist to see if they were prepared for disaster. I will tell you that people coming to a county fair don't necessarily want to be talking about disasters. However, we were there at the face now, handing them stuff they can take with them and look at after that. We've also focused in our Citizens Academy or Residents Academy on really focused that change on, instead of talking about here's what we do as emergency management, but instead we've migrated that conversation to what they as residents can do to protect themselves and be ready for disasters. On top of that, we pretty regularly get requests from community groups to go out and actually speak with them and talk about things that they can do to prepare themselves. So we're in long-term care facilities, we're in different housing units and different schools. So we're pretty active in trying to engage the community, specifically with the mission of talking about how they can increase their individual level of preparedness. And as we talk about all those things we do, one of the keys for us is that we understand that we as a county can't provide everything for everyone. So we as a county get much stronger when we focus on building the individual resilience up of our community. So as people become more disaster tolerant and more capable of helping themselves, it requires less burden on county services, and ultimately allows us to focus on what we need to focus on as a county, and hope that people are able to take care of themselves as long as possible.
So you mentioned the national data. So on page 7, you've got the National Survey of Preparedness for Hazard Profiles. And so just how does that help you when you're comparing and looking at some of the pieces that you just talked about, using this data to help inform your work?
So this was actually a data set that we hadn't been looking at until pretty recently. So just to guide where this data is coming from, FEMA has for a few years now been doing a nationwide survey of communities all across, or residents all across the United States. So it's a few people from Minnesota, a few from every other state, and they try and focus in on a really good mix and a really good sample of the population. And they ask specific questions about what people are doing to actually prepare themselves. So as we look at this data, what we can see is that people have different things that drive their individual preparedness. So awareness is really an interesting line on this chart. Somehow we're missing out nationwide on connecting to people, on helping them be prepared to help themselves. And one of the really interesting things, looking deep into the data that I learned, is that people's awareness of natural hazards specifically and disasters that could be impacting them was pretty high before COVID. And then as we went through the COVID pandemic, people's awareness levels actually reduced. So here we are in the middle of one of the biggest national disasters we've experienced in years, and people's awareness of their potential impact in a disaster actually reduced for some reason. Why that is, I don't understand. But we need to understand that people are, even though we've been through a lot lately, people aren't seeing aren't perceiving the risks to be as high as they had been in the past. So the data is very interesting, and I don't understand necessarily the psychology behind everyone's responses, but it's very interesting to see some of this trending nationwide.
So page 7, it says, the slide is National Survey of Preparedness, and then page 8 is National Survey of Influencers. What is the difference between these two slides? What is influencers?
So honestly, Evan's the guy who put all this data together. I'm going to give credit where it's due. I pointed him to the data and said, what can you make out of this? So since he's standing at a podium, I'm going to put him on the spot.
Okay, so as my understanding of this data is that the influencers to preparedness have to do with the precursors to those items on the other slides. So either you're prepared for each of those things or not, and then these are the precursors to being prepared or not. So what are the steps that you would have to take to be prepared for each of those areas, and have you taken those steps?
Thank you, Evan.
Yeah.
He acted really well on being put on the spot.
Scott, could we look at page 9? So this is the percent of 911 calls that are answered within the national standards timelines. And this has been a performance area that has been challenging. And certainly this data would suggest some improvement. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Absolutely. So even though it's within our division separate from emergency management, I oversee both the 911 communications center, the radio operations, and then emergency management, kind of wear 3 hats. One of the huge challenges we had when I started 7 years ago is that we were underperforming in the 911 center. There's 2 key national standards that are out there that are really important for us to measure ourselves against. One is how quickly we are able to answer those incoming 911 calls. And the second is how quickly we're able to dispatch out fire departments. So this slide talks about the first area that we really focused on addressing is that we weren't meeting the standard. We increased some training, but the key element and why we weren't meeting the standard is we were grossly understaffed at the time. So we've made a significant effort to make sure that we were obtaining and hiring and getting good quality people in our communication center. And as we've done that, as we've been able to increase our staff, what you can see is that, yes, we've shown continuous improvement in that area, and now we're well exceeding. So looking at the standard, the standard is 90% of calls have to be answered within 10 seconds. So, and I kind of want to caveat that, or talk about what that really means. The majority of our calls come from cell phones. It takes 2 to 3 seconds for a cell phone to actually come into the 911 system. So if you've had to call 911, you know it takes a little bit before that call actually gets there. So we're talking about 10 seconds on the standard. It's really more like 12 or 13 seconds. So the national standard was set that it's okay that 1 out of 10 people have to wait 12 or 13 seconds before someone's going to answer their call. I think our community has a much higher expectation for service. And what we actually find out in our area is that if people don't have their call answered within 11 or 12 seconds, they hang up and call again. That creates a whole nother set of problems for us because now we have what's called an abandoned 911 call that we have to call back, and we have a new incoming 911 call that has to be processed. So by increasing our staffing, by increasing our ability to answer those calls and making sure we have staffing working at the right time of day, we're able to really show some improvement on that. And 911 is an area that we have a ton of data in, and we're able to use that data to schedule how many people are working at any given point in time. So we know specifically, obviously summers in Scott County are extremely busy for everybody, but especially in those areas. But we also know that our busiest hour of the week is from 4 p.m. till 5 p.m. on a Monday or Tuesday. So using our data, we know that for whatever reason, that's been consistent over the last 6 years, that's our busiest time. So that's when we put the most people on our staff. And we're able to then make sure we're effectively answering those phone calls and getting service to the community.
I want to just give either Luke or Adam a chance to respond to that as well. That's been an area we've been looking at for staff turnover and just that, especially through COVID, and if there's anything you wanted to add to Scott's description about.
I think to emphasize too, as Scott talked about, it's not necessarily that we added a lot of staff or we've been fully staffed, it's that he's used the math behind the call volumes to really adjust those shifts. For in the past, areas, 24/7 areas are really staffed with like 3 shifts, day, afternoon, and the overnight, right? And you just put people on those different shifts, and his staff really comes in on increments all throughout the day to build up to that staffing level and drop down. So it's a lot of more math behind it of how to really get the right amount of people there at the right times to do our work versus thinking of like a 3-shift, 24-hour operation. So it's been a lot of Scott's work behind the scenes using kind of those call volumes, radio usage data to kind of drive when we have people working or not to try to fill that. And then a lot of this too is we may need 5 people at a certain time of the day, but if we're understaffed, that just means we're pulling people in or holding them over on their shifts through overtime and other things that to make it work. So even though we may not be fully staffed, we still hit these guidelines based on how we utilize staff.
Thank you.
So this slide mentions that the less urgent callers are sometimes placed on hold. Is that a result of the staffing challenges, or is that something that you would do?
So that's something that we've always had to do in our area. So some very large communication centers, once the telecommunicator answers the call, they are on that call till they're done. And anything incoming is just going to wait in queue until somebody's available to take the call. In Scott County, we prioritize our incoming calls. So some, like Dakota County is our neighbor to the east, they've have everybody call 911 for every call. There's benefits to doing that and getting additional location information into the center. But the downside of that is that it makes it more difficult to triage those calls coming in. So with us, we have calls that come in on 911, and we have calls that come in on our non-emergency numbers. And our standard is to answer those 911 calls first. Once a call is answered, if there's additional lines ringing, we do as a practice here, put people on hold if there's a call that continues to ring. So if someone calls on 911 and says that they locked their keys in their car, and yet another 911 line rings, the person who locked their keys in the car is going to get put on hold while we check that other 911 call and see if that is a true emergency. And if it is, then we deal with that call first, and then we come back as soon as someone's clear. They'll come back and provide service to the person who needs help getting into their car.
I see we have some partners here at the table, so maybe it might be a good idea to, I'd be interested in hearing a little bit about how you partner. I see we've got Prior Lake Schools here on how that worked, how that has come together, and maybe some lessons learned and how you plan to move forward.
Yeah, I'll kick this one off and then pass it on. So one of the interesting areas about emergency management is that part of our role is an internal facing organization. So we provide service and planning for the county, how the county does business. But on top of that, we're also an externally facing organization as well. So the county is designated by FEMA and by the feds as the contact point for all things disasters. It's unique in tribal government, and Kurt will talk about that. But just as we serve internally and serve the different divisions within the county in planning and preparing the county itself to survive and recover from a disaster, we also have the role in working with our partners in all of our communities as well. So it's really a split role that we have to accomplish, and that can be difficult, and it can be a lot of work, but it's really important to understand that we focus internally and externally with our partners, and our success truly relies on the success of our partners. If Kurt's having a bad day in his area, it means that Scott County's having a bad day. And that's been our guiding philosophy on working with our partners and ensuring that they're doing as well as they can be.
I would second that. Some of the things that we deal with as an employee for a tribal sovereign nation are different than what Scott County or the state of Minnesota will have effect. But what we found out is if it affects us, it affects you. And the tribal end of it gives us some opportunities where the community has said, be a good neighbor. And if we partner with things like mitigation and debris removal, and Scott and I have worked together extensively with UASI, which is Urban Area Security Initiative, to do the response to terrorism not only in Scott County, but it goes out to Dakota County, Hennepin County, Ramsey County. The bridge collapse taught us that we can't do it alone, and we have to have strong partners. I always tell the story that I worked the bridge collapse for 72 hours. I was nowhere near the bridge. I was on an ambulance covering Scott County during that time, so that Alina could be at the bridge. And that's the partnership we try to work with every day, whether it's emergency management, law enforcement, fire, EMS.
School safety is obviously a community-wide concern, statewide and nationwide concern. My role was new, and I started less than 3 months ago as Emergency Preparedness and Response Coordinator. The school district didn't have somebody dedicated full-time to the concerns of school safety, although I think my colleagues that were focused on it put a lot more than part-time work into it. They partnered with Scott. They partnered with emergency management from Ramsey County, from local fire departments and law enforcement agencies to build a really comprehensive crisis management plan, and they exercise it regularly. In my short 3 months or less with this position, Scott has been a really visible partner. Emergency management from Scott County has been very visible. I know him and now Kurt pretty well, just in the short time. He being Scott, has been at the reunification trainings that we've hosted Tomorrow we have a community crisis response team tabletop exercise where we're bringing partners from law enforcement, fire, emergency management, other schools in our district, the parochial schools, ambulance service, just a whole comprehensive team to look at a few different scenarios, how we would manage them, and just getting to know the partners before the emergency occurs so that we are well prepared. My coworkers also mentioned specifically that Scott was heavily involved in a rollout program for our radio system. I think they were talking a little bit about patching so that if we do have an incident in our district that we can communicate with the county because that, excuse me, as we've seen across the country, there's been always, the downfall in incidents is communications and who's where, who's doing what, and when these school incidents occur, it is massive. It involves a lot of people. It involves a lot of responders. Everybody's showing up. Even some folks that are well-intended and wanting to help show up. But that makes for a very chaotic environment, and ensuring that we have clear communications and coordination with our partners ahead of time provides us for a smooth response to an incident should it occur. Now, we hope it never does, but we want to be incredibly well prepared should it. So we are looking forward to working with Scott and now Mr. Lane as well, going forward, receiving their expertise and their perspectives from the law enforcement and communications and emergency preparedness side.
You know, can I ask one of the things that Scott and I have talked about a long time is it's hard to get data in this area to show. It's hard to prove prevention, right? It's hard to prove all the bad things that don't happen. Are there markers that any of you look at that tell you that as a community we are more resilient or getting stronger or better prepared? The resident survey data certainly talked about what residents think, but are there things you look at that tell you if the work that we're doing is making the difference in preparedness that you want it to make? That's like to anybody on the panel, but
I'll start with Scott and I have worked extensively together as he had said, if we're having a bad day, you're having a bad day. Our citizens are in your area, your citizens are in our area. And part of what we base everything on is our plans. And whether it's our hazard mitigation plan, emergency operation plan, the THIRA, all of those we work together so that we become a part of their plan, they become a part of our plan. And that includes the schools, the highways, law enforcement. When we have that basis of response and then we test it, that gives us a good basis of at least we respond in the way we're supposed to and the way we train to. The other part that happens is that we always plan for the worst and hope for the best. And it's a misnomer in our world that you can plan for everything. And it just can't happen. So the data is, you're 100% correct. It's very difficult to show what that is. One of the ways is how the response goes in past histories. The Blakely response with the flooding, the response was excellent done. And when you go back and do your after actions, that gives us the data that our plans were in place, our plans were used effectively, and we responded correctly.
nice, thank you.
If we look at this slide on page 10, it's talking about the NIMS compliance. On page 3 of the packet, it notes that NIMS compliance is a requirement for many federal funding sources and disaster aid, and also notes that some staff in the county are not yet finished with their training on that. So is the county, does it require 100% compliance, or is the county have enough people trained to meet the requirement to be eligible for that funding?
That's a great question. So the standard is that anybody who could respond to a disaster or emergency should be trained in the 100, 200, and 700 NIMS classes. These are the classes that I consider to be an awareness level class. These are not going to make you proficient. They're not going to make you an expert. They're very I call them the overview or awareness level training. So the standard is everybody who could respond to an emergency should be there. We as a county have adopted the standard that everybody needed to get moved forward into this level of training countywide, and we actually initiated this. It must have been back in 2018, based on when we started actually collecting the data. So a conversation I had with our administrator at the time, was that, listen, we can't predict what's going to happen in the future, but we know that we could have something really big. And if something really big happens, we need to have all of our staff at least to this awareness level training so that they can function in a role. Coincidentally, about 2 years later, we had something really big happen. And it was helpful that we had people who had already gone through that awareness level training, that basic training, as we stepped up, not knowing how we were going to be impacted by the pandemic. One of the tactics that we did was we had our group of people were put into a EOC or incident management team to try and figure out how to move forward and deal with what it was still or was an infodemic more than a pandemic, because we had so much information coming at us and the world changed every 2 hours, it seemed like. So as we're proceeding through that path, having built a group of people who at least had the basics down was really helpful, because it really showed us that you could be somebody who worked down at the customer service window and you are now pulled into a team and you're going to be working that disaster. We don't typically think of that role being utilized, but the pandemic was a perfect example of how deep within our organization that response required assets and resources to be pulled, especially knowing that early days, it sounded like that COVID was so transmittable that we were very concerned that if we had a member of one of those teams get sick, the whole team could get sick. So as a result, we had to create 3 separate tiers or 3 separate teams that were on a rotating schedule. So being able to staff 3 teams and then go for a couple days with each team, then rotate out to another team, it was extremely, honestly, it was extremely invasive into our organization as far as pulling a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily be in an emergency response role, who had to come in and step up. And I'm still very proud about how all of our staff members performed. I think a lot of people who you never considered they would have a possible chance of ever being involved in that kind of response showed up and they did their best. And I think the county can be proud of people, especially people who are at lower levels of our organization who don't necessarily normally have that level of authority and responsibility. People really stepped up. And I think that was really impressive. And I think that was a credit to our staff, the quality of our staff, and how people care for their community.
I'll take on to that. Our school district crisis response team is also trained in IS 100, 200, and 700. So we have a couple dozen folks that are now aware of National Incident Management System, and we employ that into our own response efforts and reunification plans. And it also makes our staff available. We're starting to have conversations with other school districts about mutual aid agreements and things like law enforcement does, should there be an incident in another neighboring school district where we could support them.
So, Scott, you had said that NIMS is sort of that basic training, and then there's some narrative in here about another group, like a more highly trained select few that would go into a team, and they would need additional training, and then is that the ICS 300 that you had mentioned? Is that the training that they would need?
So the 300 course is probably the first course that deals with an increased level of complexity. There are a number of staff members in the county, that was a small group, that have been through the 300 course. On top of that, there is a 400 course, which honestly is really complex, for really complex incidents that most people here are never going to use. Part of our plan moving forward, as we've looked at what happened with our response to the pandemic, how we can improve, is that we've identified that we need to get back to what was done a number of years ago, where the county had personnel designated in certain roles that they would be a part of an incident management team should a disaster happen. The county had that 20 years ago and at some point in time stopped pursuing that, and I think that's an area that we identified after the pandemic as being a weakness that we need to improve. We asked the board for a budget increase for 23 to provide a training beyond that 300 course, which is an all-hazard incident management team training, and we received that funding. It was an expensive ask, but our intention as we move forward, thankfully we've got Bob here in the room, as well, who literally just started yesterday as a deputy EM director, so we didn't put him in the line of fire today. But as we are proceeding with our plan, we're going to get back to identifying what are those key roles in the organization where people should be prepared to step up into an emergency response role, and designate that within the job description of each one of those roles, and then provide that advanced level of a training. So the all-hazard incident management team training, something Kurt and I have been through, it's really, really good training. You spend a week going through scenarios, and I think the thing I like about it most is that the instructors are all people who have 25, 30 years of incident management experience, high quality, people who've got tons of experience, and they walk in on day one and say, we are not the NIMS police. If you use the wrong term, but you get it right, that's a win. This isn't about using the right terminology. It's not about being perfect. It's about looking at a complex situation, organizing it, and getting to the outcomes we want to get to. And it's a really effective training that our county, once we're able to get this team identified, get people through this training, we're going to be significantly stronger moving forward.
On page 4, kind of maybe dovetails a little bit on resource commitment, and there's a point that's pulled out, I guess, comparing Carver County's allotment of about 100 hours per week to ours of about 55 hours. And so just maybe, can you talk about maybe what concerns you with that, or maybe what's not getting done because of that?
So we did a informal survey where I asked all of our neighbors to help me understand how many staff hours were dedicated towards emergency management, so I could kind of establish a baseline of where we sat. And I don't know if we actually got that slide finished.
Page
here.
12.
Page 12, perfect. So in emergency management, as I said earlier, I wear multiple hats. So I'm the county's emergency management director, and I oversee the 911 communications area and our radio communication system. And then on top of it, I'm also a sworn captain. So occasionally I do what's needed by the organization, by the sheriff's office as well. That's not the normal model, at least in the metro and even our neighbors as we proceed further outstate. Carver County is the only other county in the metro that has that model where there's one person who oversees 911 and emergency management. But in their area, they've had a lot more staff dedicated towards the management side of the 911 side. So they've always had a full-time PSAT manager who is strictly an admin position. And then they've had supervisors who are also dedicated to the admin role of the 911 center. In Scott County, we just got our PSAT manager position back about a year ago or so. And our supervisors here are working supervisors. So they're actually on the floor taking calls. So because we didn't have enough staffing to kind of take that Carver model where the supervisors can truly be true supervisors, our supervisors are working, taking calls, and trying to do supervisory duties when they're not busy. So we've always been significantly tighter on staffing over here than the Carver model. So in Carver County, their director says she estimates that about 75% of her time is really focused on emergency management. Then she has 2 full-time deputy director positions under her to work on emergency management. So they're putting quite a bit of time in here. Realistically, I've been about 35 hours a week on 911 communications and the communication system, and then somewhere in the 10 to 15 hours a week on emergency management. And we've had 1 full-time deputy director. If we compare that with a lot of our neighbors, what you see is that our complement of staff is significantly lower than the neighbors that are around us. And ultimately what that means is we are doing what we can with the resources we have, but there's a lot of things that we're not getting done, and we haven't gotten done. And at the end of the day, I think we've done less with less, and there's been a consequence to the county in that we aren't as prepared as we should be. Ultimately, I've got a lot of, as we look for the things that I want to accomplish, It's very difficult because those are all things that take a lot of time, a lot of planning time, a lot of resources, and we haven't necessarily had those resources here.
So Scott, kind of maybe this answers one of my questions. In the next steps, it says, one of the things is to restart an exercise planning cycle. And there it says, it notes Scott County remains at a high risk of active violence due to number of entertainment venues in the county. And then so my questions, are there concerns of waiting to do these types of trainings and exercises till 24, moving them on? And what are the concerns if you don't have the time or the staff to do those exercises?
Well, so there's a couple, about 3 questions in there. I'll try and answer all of
Sorry
them.
about that.
So one is, yes, Scott County, because we are a part of River South, we have a lot of large entertainment venues here. Some of those are more fixed, like Valley Fair, Canterbury, and some of them are more pop-up locations like the Renaissance Festival, sitting in the back. Each one of those events brings additional risk of something bad happening to Scott County. No matter what, every county across the country has some risk. A school shooting can happen anywhere. We have to be ready for that. But if you look at soft targets and the current trending from intelligence on where the threats are to our homeland, it's the uptick in domestic violent extremism, I got the acronym right, and the risk to our soft targets. A lot of the research that I've read recently talks about where the most likely area to be attacked would be right now, and research that the federal government has done has determined that there's actually a lower risk that a large stadium like US Bank or even Target Field would be attacked. And the reason for that is because of the large population at those stadiums. They have a large police presence, they have scanners, they have a lot of security in place. And all those things are detracting to people who would want to disrupt the world and be involved in a terrorism event. They're looking for an area that would impact commerce, would impact people's perceptions of safety. And if doing something at a stadium is too difficult, it's not difficult for us to surmise that there's a lot of places in Scott County where we have a lot of pop-up events and a lot of fixed events, and a lot of people come in here where if something bad happens here, it's going to have a regional impact, if not a nationwide impact. So we are constantly working in an environment where we have a bigger risk. And that's just part of who we are, and part of it is we enjoy having River South and the entertainment venues. And I worked at Valley Fair 25 years ago, and it was a great place to work, and that's why I'm still here as someone who grew up from outstate. So these are really great parts of our community, but they do bring additional risk into us. All right, so I answered one of your 3 questions, and now I forgot the other 2.
So are there consequences of not having enough time or staffing to address those?
Yes, so
Since we do have higher risk here in Scott County.
at the end of the day, the amount we can do to improve our response to these areas is going to improve how we would actually function should a bad day happen here. So the time we spend doing that is very key. We have what we call a full-scale exercise cycle where we do a big disaster drill. What people think of the big disaster drill, police, fire, public works, all moving around. We were on par to do one actually in partnership with Shakopee, Mdewakanton, and Sioux community in 2021. It was called Asher 21, an active shooter hostile event response. With that, we had partners of Mystic Lake Security, Valley Fair, Canterbury Park, and we were working to build an exercise that would simulate a bad day happening at one of those events, simulate the public safety response, and understand what our unique capabilities are here and what we needed to improve upon. As we were building towards that, we also had some trainings that were occurring with police, fire, and EMS, building towards that active or hostile event response, where we were out at our regional training center for a number of different days, and we had police, fire, and EMS personnel going into a simulated hostile event working together in partnership to go in and recover and rescue the people who are injured, get them out, give them to a transportation location, and get them to ultimately to definitive care. So we actually didn't stop all training by any means, but when COVID came in and we couldn't have in-person meetings, we didn't know what the future was going to be like. That really put a damper on our planning efforts for this, and we had to make the decision to postpone that full scale, not knowing what the environment was going to look like. So we've recently begun those conversations again. It's going to be a partnership between Scott County and Shakopee, Mdewakanton, and Sioux community to build a full-scale exercise and go test the capabilities again. You know, there's another thing I want to highlight that, you know, kind of popped in my brain as I was walking through these situations. If something happens in Minneapolis and a lot of people are hurt, Minneapolis has some resources that we simply don't have here. They have a lot of people. They have some different infrastructure. They also have a very close proximity to level 1 trauma centers. When somebody gets very, very badly hurt here in Scott County, there's a solid 40-minute drive to get to a trauma center. So if we have a bad day here and a lot of people are hurt, we have to be able to make sure that our responders have advanced training and have advanced equipment so that they can stabilize those injuries very quickly. One of the things we've done with that is we actually have in all of our squad cars, even our detective cars, have trauma bags in them for our sheriff's office. So if any of our staff were to respond to an active event, we've got advanced medical equipment in there, number of tourniquets, chest seals to take care of puncture wounds that would be penetrating the chest cavity, a gauze, a lot of tools that are there so we can, instead of waiting for the ambulances to show up, our police officers can initiate that response right away, stabilize those injured parties, and give them the best chance of success.
All right. I wanted to ask, as we were planning for this conversation, it was important to the sheriff's office to include the highway folks and the folks on Joe Weda's team. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about why you thought that was important and what the communication is with that group as we look at our internal or our capability to respond.
So I just want to say the biggest thing that everybody needs to recognize is that public works are the heroes of any disaster. Didn't get Joe's face red at all, but if you think about even the pandemic, totally a public health related disaster, who was out setting up the drive-through clinics? Who was organizing what the traffic flow is going to look like? Who was moving the barricades around? We always rely on our public folks, our public works staff. We need any kind of heavy lifting, whether that be setting up for immunization clinics or drive-through clinics, or it's pulling trees out that are accumulating in the river. Public works is our go-to when we need any kind of heavy lifting, any kind of manpower to solve a big problem. So they're always the ones who are kind of behind the scenes, and they get the call and they deliver what needs to be delivered. And I think for our office, it was really important to invite them to the table and make sure that we talk about that, because they really do save everybody when it comes down to disasters of any kind, whether it be a tornado that comes through and we have a huge debris management issue to take care of, road closures, repair. Joe spent a lot of time, even going back to our 19 or 14 floods, on dealing with what the impact of the roads are. And honestly, when it comes down to talking to FEMA, I can say, here's where a road's damaged and we need some riprap or something like that. I kind of can say the words. Joe knows what he's talking about. He can say exactly what was necessary and why, and that's a far more convincing delivery of information than I can do. So he's the expert. His team are the people who actually solve problems in many of our disasters. And we really like to highlight that.
So is your team then included in some of the prep or the planning and as some of these events are simulated?
Yeah, of course. They've all been through the NIMS training. And then we also participate in some of the exercises. I remember what year it was. We had one out at the fairgrounds, and we had several key staff involved in that exercise out at the fairgrounds.
Okay, all right.
So speaking of pulling trees out of the river, like what's our current state of preparedness with our rising floodwaters?
So we've been watching the river for quite a while. So in Scott County, we have overland flooding where we have too much rain and things like our ponds, our lakes get big. And then we have river flooding. And they're very different, even though they kind of get lumped together. They're very different risks. So this year we had reason to be concerned about overland flooding. And then we had a lot of snowpack. We had a lot of moisture in that snow. But thankfully, because we had been in a drought for 2 years, our soil was extremely, extremely dry. And partially because of the fact that we had snowfall first instead of hard cold, and the fact that our soil was so dry, when we did start experiencing a melt, the soil soaked up that water very quickly. Even with rain on top of snow, those are usually really, really bad days for us. The soil was so dry and there wasn't a frost layer preventing the absorption. So that melt and the rain was able to go into the soil really quickly. So our overland flooding risk this year really mitigated itself and equalized the drought effect that we've been experiencing for a couple years. Regarding river flooding, right now we're at a perfect time to have this conversation here before the board. We're actively monitoring the river. One of the first big impact points we see in Scott County is when the water levels of the Minnesota River get high enough that we have to close the Jordan River crossing. And we have to close that crossing, not necessarily because the road's too low or the bridge is too low on our side, but after you go across the bridge into Carver County, the road actually dips a bit. And as that road dips and goes through that low section along the river, as the river comes up, unfortunately water will start to get and encroach upon the travel lanes, and that's the point where we have to do a closure. Right now, the forecast out for 1 week from now is showing that we're going to be 1 foot below the point where that closure hits a week out. Looking upstream, we know that the river's already crossed at Montevideo. As you look further down to Mankato, you can see that there's a forecast for that area to the river to plateau pretty quickly here. But what's concerning is that after it plateaus, about 6 days out from now, there's going to be one little blub of water that comes through and surges one more time, and that could rise the river another foot to 1.5 foot. And these are all based on the forecast right now that we're watching. The forecasts change, and the forecasts also don't include future rain beyond the 24-hour window. So if we get a lot of heavy rain, we should expect that the impacts are going to be larger. If we stay dry, we can expect the impacts to be, where they are or lower. So right now we're forecast at least a week out to be 1 foot below the point where we have to close that out, but we know that our crest point is probably a few days beyond that. So we're going to be very close to the point where we have to close that Jordan crossing. The only real impact we're seeing right now is that the trails that go under the Bloomington Ferry Bridge are now closed because of the high water. So as far as a flood year and a spring flood risk, this is actually a lower risk than normal year. So we're going to have the impacts potentially at Jordan, and I know Joe's team's been watching that as well. But there's a really good chance that we're going to see a crest just below that closure point, and we're going to be okay.
All right. Any final questions from the facilitators? All right. Then, Mr. Chairman, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Questions from the board? I've got a couple. There were a couple of statements that were made or are in the report that are troubling. We're doing less with less, and we're not as prepared as we want to be. Well, that's a problem. And I think we need to, when we're going budgeting and we're looking at staffing, we need to address that. The worst thing that can happen is, at least to us as electeds, is to have some kind of event and then not be prepared and the public go, what were you doing? As a county board, what were you doing? Why wasn't this funded better? Why weren't you prepared? We don't want to have that. We want to be, and I heard also we can't prepare for everything. I get that. There's things that we're going to see or experience, that are unique or like with the pandemic. I would say, I know we're not talking about that today, but we were not, as a society, prepared for that. The PPE was woefully lacking everywhere at the start of that, so we've learned some things. I think we scored higher on our assessment from the community because the county did do a tremendous effort in regard to the pandemic, and people are really pleased, I think, by what the county did during that crisis. But I'd say we as a board, I think whether it's the road safety or whatever it is, we've always said safety is our highest priority. And so if we don't have the staffing and we're doing less with less and we're not as prepared as we want to be, we got to address that. That's my commentary. I do have another question. I was aware, obviously, my son was applying around in law enforcement, and he ultimately got a job in Colorado Springs, which was his main desire. But he had an EMT, and I was kind of shocked, surprised that really was no credit at that time. That, in other words, no law enforcement said, "Oh, you're an EMT." Nobody perked up to that. It was like, "Well, we don't require that. That's nice, but it's no big deal." That was kind of the response back then. Has that changed, do you think? And is having our officers become EMTs well, first off, if you hire, do you give any kind of points or extra credit for somebody that comes with that as well? And are we encouraging our officers to become EMTs?
Yeah, Commissioner, I can answer that. So we did add that recently in the last year or two as one of our preference when you're hiring or applying for a deputy.
Yeah.
Help you get an interview, help you get some more points. We don't require it just because there's so few people applying as well, but adding more, similar to some communities were making 4 degrees required a handful of years ago, and now said, oh, that's even dampers our options more. So we don't require it, but it is an initiative we have. The pandemic kind of messed that up as well, but we were starting to also send one deputy a year through EMT training through the community here, the tribal community, to get them trained. And as Scott mentions, medical response is a big deal in our communities, especially in our townships, where the ambulance responses are somewhat delayed, and or now because of staffing levels, they're even more delayed, where it might be that Milwaukee and Public Safety is coming with their ambulance because Alina is already tied up and has nobody available. So we see even some longer response times, up to 20 minutes to get to a medical. So we do think that is important, and as our community ages and the people are living in their homes longer as well, the whole way we operate, we see that medicals are a huge part of the work we do in responding to emergencies and providing, and then lastly, I would add, it's also a huge one for law enforcement. When we come to a medical and provide care, we're providing a positive interaction with the community that is really important. And I see some communities around our state and country go, well, fire department will go to medicals, cops will just do this other stuff. And I'm like, but you're losing that ability to provide that service. No different than we help somebody in a lockout or a basic thing like that. We're doing a funeral escort. May not be a definite law enforcement need, but it's that positive interaction with the community that's engaging the community in a positive way that we have a win. So I think medicals are important about many areas to me. So I agree.
I got one little follow-up on that. Yeah. When I Googled it, I didn't really know how many hours, according to what I Googled, it's about 170 hours to become an EMT. Is that kind of close, or is that about right?
Yeah, it was 120 when I took it, but that was in the 90s.
I actually teach EMT for Shaka Veteran Sioux community. So yeah, it's approximately 120 hours required. Then we fill in another 40 hours with patient contacts and others. So yeah, approximately 160 to complete and get your EMT. I've been an EMT since 1989.
Okay. Then the question would be, is there anything the board needs to do to fund or encourage more officers getting that rather than one a year? It seems like it'll take forever to work its way through a force, but if there's anything you could recommend to us, I want to hear that later someday,
That's a great idea. We'll consider that when we get the budget for next year.
That's it.
Thank you. Jody, did I see?
In the news recently has been the train disasters, and I'm curious to know, do we have a good relationship with the rails? Do we understand the chemicals that are moving through the communities? And do we have a good plan in place in case there's a disaster that happens on the rails?
So rail obviously runs the whole length of our county along the river, and we currently have Union Pacific as the dominant rail provider in our area. We've been through trainings with the rail. Some of the fire departments, excuse me, some of the fire departments have also gone some advanced trainings on how to deal with rail accidents. But rail accidents are, in and of themselves, they're an extremely threatening thing. If you look at what's actually coming through our community on a daily basis on those trains, there's an extremely high number of hazardous materials coming through. The consequence from a rail disaster is, as we could see with East Palestine, it's huge. And it's not something like you can come in, clean it up, and move forward. I fully believe that in 10 years and 15 years, people are still going to be talking about how many people in that community that didn't leave are going to have long-term health impacts as a result of the exposures that they received. So yes, we're getting training for that. We've got tools, like I have an app on my phone that's credentialed that allows me to see what's on any train that's coming through our community based on the IDs in the train. So we have some real-time information with that. But we have to know if we have a disaster or a wreck similar to what happened in East Palestine, it's going to be a very significant, it's a very long-term consequence event. The other aspect with rail, which is unique, is they're federally protected. So we could try to create ordinances or rules that would say you can't do this or you can't do that. They aren't going to honestly follow it. Even when we had the Blakely disaster and the hills slid, the rail came through and tried to get their equipment in to go fix their rail because they lose a lot of money when that rail is closed. County tried to stop them. Within minutes, they had a order from a federal judge preventing us from stopping them from accessing the roads which we'd closed. So they have a lot of power and a lot of money. So there are some limits to what we as a local community can do to stop any action from them. So the key for us is really to understand what's coming through, make plans for it, and know that communication is going to be a key element of any response for us. And know that it's going to be big and it's going to be long term. I think that's the thing that watching the news and looking at the details of specifically the East Palestine incident is there's a lot of people saying it's safe, it's okay. My opinion is it's not. I know Kate and I have had conversations from the hazardous materials side on what the real impacts are. And like I said, I fully believe 10 to 15 years from now, we're going to hear about how the soil is still poisonous in that area. And we just need to know that if something like that were to happen, especially having government facilities so close to a train line here and track now, the consequences are going to be huge. And we have to think about our continuity of government and what that means if something were to happen here in Shakopee. We also have to think about what that means to our population. Because if people aren't safe in their homes, they're not going to live here. They're not going to stay here, and the consequences are cascading very quickly. So those are horrible things. There's a lot of federal regulation that has been done to try and make rail safer. And I think now that it's in the spotlight, we should expect to see even more regulations come into play. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of very bad chemicals that come by rail, and that's done on a regular basis. As a community that has a switching station here, we do have probably more derailments than normal communities do, just because we have a lot of trains that are switching cars here and there. And when that kind of thing happens, it happens oftentimes at 1 to 3 in the morning. And it just takes one mistake for a car to go off the line. One of the pictures that if Evan can flip through back to our picture slide in the packet, one of the things that we've experienced here is we have had quite a few small-scale derailments where trains do go off the tracks. Looking at that top left picture, that was on the train track right in front of Valley Fair, where a number of years ago unfortunately we've had more than one at that location. As the two tracks come into one, the train did follow the merge point correctly, and they went off. In that case, we just had a spill of, I think that one was just grain in that location, so nothing hazardous, but on the train right next to it, there was ethanol. So that could have been bad. Thankfully, that one was a winter event, so there weren't people at the entertainment venues, and it was 3 a.m. So the consequences would have been a little bit mitigated from that, but this is the kind of thing that's happened. Another one that occurred in that same location was just potash that's spilled. So again, not a hazardous material, but those trains are moving bad stuff through our community all the time.
So how do you notify the community of an event that's happening? I know Code Red was utilized at some point, and I don't know if that still is the preferred.
Yep, so we've got a few different methods to communicate with the community. We have our social media pages for even like the flooding. We put out a message yesterday helping the community be aware of that. That's one of our tools. Another tool that we have is our Code Red system. Code Red is an opt-in system. So those people who register to be notified by Code Red will get alerts from that. Another tool we have that's more effective is called the iPause network. So we actually use the Code Red application to access that network. But through the iPause network, I can activate an EAS, an emergency alert system, that would go out over televisions and radio, and wireless emergency alert. Wireless emergency alerts are, if you ever received an Amber Alert on your phone, that's a wireless emergency alert. So we have the capability with Scott County Emergency Management to activate those types of alerts. In fact, when we had the flooding of, I think, 2019 in Jordan, we actually activated a wireless emergency alert warning people in that area of the flooding, and then identified in that alert where the shelter location was. So people in that community who were impacted by that flash flooding event were able to receive an alert on their phones, identifying that there was flash flooding impacting Valley Green Trailer Park and that the shelter was at the high school. So that is wireless emergency alerts are opt-out solutions instead of opt-in solutions. So when you get a new phone, your phone's capable of receiving a wireless emergency alert. If you go deep enough into the settings, you can find a way to shut it off, but most people don't do that. So that is our most effective mass notification tool that we have in a crisis, and our emergency management division is able to activate those alerts as needed. And actually teach a class on how to activate those alerts to future EM directors in our across the state. So I've been on the committee for iPause for a number of years across the state, creating the policy and best practices for that. And now I teach a class to upcoming emergency management directors, teaching them about alert and warning and working with the Weather Service.
I have one more. I had been on the community emergency response team a number of years ago, and we had done sandbagging down in Blakely at one point. Is that something that is still utilized, and is that beneficial to have those volunteers to do that kind of work? Yep. Or do we just use Joe and Public Works to take care of that?
So, well, Joe does take care of a lot of things, but we focus Joe's attention on those things that impact public infrastructure primarily, and the public response. There's also the private response, which is best served by volunteers. We could use county staff to go sandbag. We have a large group of dedicated volunteers for Scott County that are very willing to come out and help. Good example was in that 2019 flooding of Valley Green. Our SafeCom team was activated for that, and they went to the high school. They set up the initial phase of the human shelter at the high school until the Red Cross comes and took over. And just so everybody understands, the Red Cross is a great asset when they're available. They're not always available, but when they are, they're a great asset. They're great partners we work with. But even in the best case, they're 6 to 8 hours out before they can set up a shelter. So we have established the standard of we own that first 6 to 8 hours until they get here. And our volunteer group with from the SafeCom team stepped up. They did the initial aspects of registering the people who needed human shelter. And then by law, anytime we open a human shelter, we also have to open a pet shelter. And for days, our volunteers maintained a pet shelter out at the regional training center. And we took care of those pets, the people who were in the Red Cross shelter. So we've got some really great volunteers. Our SafeCom group has been trained on using our sandbagging machine. So a number of years back, we were able to purchase a machine that allows us to do sandbagging very quickly, where there's a chute with an auger in it, and then 4 different buckets. So the people who are creating sandbags, instead of scooping in like you see on TV a lot, they can hold a bag under, step on a foot pedal, the sand drops down into the bag, take their foot off the pedal, tie their bag, and move it back. So we've increased the capacity of how many sandbags we can create specifically with that asset, and then we've trained with our SafeCom group to create a couple pallets of sandbags so they're comfortable with that. And in the event of a large-scale sandbagging operation, we would use those volunteers to guide community volunteers coming in on how to do that. We don't want to necessarily tie up staff to do that. So volunteers have a huge role in helping keep our community safe.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Good questions, Commissioner Brennan. I think you got some of mine. I'm just going to follow up on that volunteer part because, Scott, you talked early on. This is really the Scott show, isn't it? Early on about the presentations to faith communities, apartment complexes, all those things, and about helping our residents be more resilient if there's an emergency. And you've gotten that message to me. It's taken me 7 years, but I get that now. Like when there's a big emergency, we can't do everything. And if the citizens here are better prepared, it'll be better. Do you have any anecdotal evidence of results or outcomes from those visits, like changes that have been made, things that, because I just think we're really onto something there, the more we can do that.
So I don't locally have good data that supports kind of the outcomes. I think that's what drove me to driving into some of the federal survey results. And I think that's something that as we proceed forward, we may include within our resident survey to try and get a better gauge out of that. At the end of the day, the steps for an individual to be prepared to survive a disaster, they're not complicated, but it takes some effort to get there. You have to, many of us have enough food to last a couple days in our homes, but not everybody. And if you have plenty of canned food, but you don't think about having a can opener, that's not going to do you any good. So there's really not complex steps, but there are steps. So we have to find a way to reach out to people, make sure that they're actually doing what they can do and they understand the risks and they can take care of themselves. As we look at that FEMA data, that's really what they're going after. They're asking people, of these 12 things, what have you done in the last year? And that's why, for me, it's an interesting data point that I think we could try and localize and see, can we see a difference? Mm-hmm. It's going to be interesting on, the responses we get to that resident survey aren't the greatest. People don't like taking surveys, but it's I think an option that we have to try and reach out and see how can we quantify the actual difference that these outreach programs are making to people.
And I'm interested in the individuals, but also interested in the groups, the faith communities, the apartment buildings, those types of things where a systematic change can be made in how they handle, their life there to impact lots of people. And then that brings me to Jody's volunteer question, because I wonder, I know we have some very talented volunteers, and I know you and key staff go do a lot of these presentations. Is it something that can be, volunteers can be trained in going out and doing these types of presentations?
And that's another great question. I think as we evolve in our mission to really focus on that individual preparedness, it is an area we can try and build that capacity. We haven't in the past, and our focus, at least my focus in coming into this role, was to try and establish the baseline of where the county is even at. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of gaps identified, and I've been working to fill those gaps. But in the last couple of years, my focus has really tried to shift towards what can we do to make the community stronger, because at the end of the day, we just can't do everything for everyone. So yes, I think there's an opportunity there where we could build teams that could go out and ultimately be force multipliers for us.
And again, I understand you've had limited time on all this, so just the thoughts that I came out. NIMS training. So we've had some really great success in getting staff trained. How often does that have to be repeated? How long is that good for?
So depending on who you ask, some people say you do it one and done. Some people say every time there's a new version that comes out, you should retake it because there's something that's changed. We're still pretty new at keeping that as a requirement across the organization. But at some point in time, we have to rethink that.
Yep.
And I'm not sure where that point is. I think when we do that, we want to make sure that we do it in a way that is truly a refresher and not saying, okay, go online and take the boring FEMA class again.
Right.
Because people are going to disengage from that very quickly.
Great, thank you. And then my last comment, I guess, when thinking about the volunteers and thinking about the preparedness, I think as we go forward, it's important to really think about our private industry and private business, especially for, our more statistically common, at least right now, emergencies, the floods, the storms, the blizzards, and how important it is for our private businesses, whether it be insurance agents, contractors, all these folks. I think about Joe and your work with salt and sand and soil and water and all that, and it's kind of a group government private effort. And I wonder if in the future there's some room as we try and make the county more resilient to get them to feel like they have a role too. So
yeah, I think there's an opportunity there. One of the things that actually changed for emergency management is that we now have a stated role for everybody who receives Medicare or Medicaid funding. They actually have to establish a relationship with their local emergency management department. And the result, or what created that, was in one of the disasters that impacted Florida. A number of people died because there was a disconnect between that facility and getting the resources they need, which was power. So people died from the exposure they were receiving in their facility. So we have now on a very regular basis been out to that whole network of in the community, and we're doing drills with them and working through plans with them. So that's an area that we've actually had to expand because of that federal requirement. So we are touching more stuff than we have in the past, but there's still a huge section of the community that we're not as actively engaged in as we could be.
Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Beard.
Thank you very much. So I just want to dovetail on Commissioner Ulrich's comments. I'm looking at the word lucky, got that circled on page 3. Heard the phrase less with less, woefully unprepared. I think was that the actual phrase?
Let's not go with that. Let's not go with that.
Can't prepare for everything. I get that. So looking at part of 3, most of 4, I guess part of 5, are these, I'm just thinking you come in a room and drop those bombs. There's got to be a, what do we need and when do we need it? Is this that list? I don't think so.
I think some of it was on our list last year.
So as we talk about the next steps,
right?
These are the areas that I'm intending to focus a lot of our energy on moving forward. These are where I see the biggest bangs being of our resource allocation moving forward. Getting people trained, doing a fundamental redesign of our emergency operations plan, which is needed. The foundation of that plan was built 20 years ago, and we've had incremental updates to it. We've started a process of completely overhauling it to make it clear, defining document of responsibility and authority, because that's been lacking in the past. Getting back into this exercise planning cycle is so key for us that we have to keep running the steps through where people identify. The big part of exercising is you have a plan, that's great, but until you exercise that plan, you don't necessarily understand all of your weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So when you do an exercise, you expose some new gaps, and then that develops your training plan moving forward. So that's why it's so important for us to be engaging in that area as well, and putting our priority into that area.
But we are going to be doing that.
Yes.
So there's no roadblock to that. COVID was, I know we had that big one planned for whenever that was, and we're gonna, so there's nothing to prevent us, the collective us, from doing those things. I'm curious, what are the things that are keeping us lucky, which I don't believe in luck, but that's a sidebar. And these other things, like what are those specific things that you can't or are precluded from doing that we need to look at? That's the list I'm super interested in.
So one of the things that I actually tried to get data for this, and I wasn't able to get it from the state. When we go to our emergency management conferences, the state always puts this picture up, and it shows the state of Minnesota, and it shows disaster declarations. And over the last 3-4 years as we've seen this graphic. Scott County is this island that hasn't been impacted nearly as much as the rest of the state. I honestly don't know why. When Wazeeka was flooding a number of years ago, Hennepin County had massive flooding, Wazeeka to our south had flooding, LeSueur County had flooding. If you looked at the total rain accumulations from that storm, there was a donut around Scott County. And a little bit of Elko had some really heavy rain, but there's just this hole that surrounded Scott County. And I think at the last presentation I did, I actually provided that graphic. This has happened repeatedly to us. And part of that is, that's great. Thankfully, our community hasn't been impacted. I'm not a gambling kind of guy, but at some point in time, the house wins, and we're going to get hit. So we have to assume that just because we've been lucky, this is not an opportunity to become complacent. We have to assume that it's going to happen and keep our effort up. One of the things that we're going to be doing, recently we got approval to add an overcomposition in emergency management. That'll give us a second deputy director spot. That honestly, it's groundbreaking for me and earth-shattering to have the capability of doubling our staff time dedicated towards this planning. It's going to make a huge difference on how we can actually accomplish things internally and externally that we need to do. So that's going to be a very significant improvement for us, and I think that's going to set us on the trajectory as we move forward to where we need to be compared to where we've been.
Well, and I mean, this is for all of us, because we are all in this thing together. Whether, you know, when a disaster strikes, there are no jurisdictional boundaries. Like, we're all hopefully pulling on the oars together because we've worked through this. So if there are things, knowing that we can't, prevent absolutely every single thing, like I get that. But if there is a list of deficiencies, whether we've looked at them before or not, things that we're working on that are in process, that's obviously very good. But are the things that, like, oh shoot, you know, we found this gap and we don't have an answer. Like, I would love to see that, like, soon. I think we all probably would. That don't know what that is, don't know what the answers would be, but just to know, like, okay, to answer some of these less with less, sounds like, you know, we're doing some of that. But if there's something that is glaring, or even not glaring, but something like, hey, we need to prepare for this, and we don't have the X, Y, and Z, like, I would like to know that.
Yep, and those are certainly things we can work on as we move forward. Some of these things are things we've been able to find some alternate funding sources for.
Yep.
We recently have congressionally funded, whatever earmarks are called nowadays.
Congressionally directed funding.
There we go. You know, we recently, as an office, had an opportunity to receive some of those funds, and part of what we are putting in for is we're putting for pumps and some equipment that we can tie with our volunteer group, not necessarily county staff, but when we have that community flooding, we've been weak on having some of those resources. So we've been able to reach out and kind of be creative in finding funding and try and address some of those small gaps, but there's certainly more as we dive deeper into it that we still need to do.
Well, we all know that earmarks are still tax dollars that we're spending, that we're, though we also know that we send more of our money out, and until that system changes, we do want to be able to have our folks' tax dollars being spent in their home turf. So again, until the system changes, that's where we're at. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.